The security guards at Westbridge Memorial in Ohio watched the screens like those watching a night aquarium. Long corridors, cold light, nothing but silence crackling in the lamps. It was a normal early morning until at 2:57 a.m. the third-floor camera recorded an impossible detail. A human form crossed the corridor without triggering any sensors, without forcing the door to open, without casting a shadow underfoot. On the monitor, the body was darker than darkness, its outline trembling like heat on asphalt, and yet, in the control room, the air grew colder. The motion sensors remained green, inert, as the figure passed before them, as if the building didn't recognize it as something alive. The instant the figure crossed the field of view of the East Wing camera, another camera on the 5th floor blinked for a second, and the same form appeared ahead of them, as if climbing 2 floors without stairs, without an elevator, without time. One of the guards swore, the other leaned, closer to the screen, and both swore they heard, from the metal structure of the ceiling, a sustained, low sound, a murmur that seemed to come from the building itself, as if the Westbridge had lungs and decided to take its first breath. They rewound the footage frame by frame, hoping for a trick. They zoomed in on the hallway, adjusted the brightness and contrast, tried to see a face, any face, but the surface was as smooth as freshly polished glass, and beneath it something seemed to move, pressing outward without being able to penetrate. One of the guards, Ethan Morales, noticed that each appearance always occurred before the clock turned to 2:58, and that the time on the cameras on the 3rd and 5th floors was identical, not with the fractional difference the network usually imposes. It was as if time on the 2 floors had been gently aligned by invisible hands. When they pressed continuous play, the figure stopped before the 5th floor camera and turned his head, not to the hallway, but to the lens itself, as if discovering he was being watched and, for the first time, wanting to watch back. All the screens darkened slightly, the ambient audio picked up a dry pop in the air duct, and, in a single frame that no one saw live, only when they paused, reflected in the glass of the fire extinguisher attached to the wall, was a mouth outlined in a smile too thin to be human. In the same fraction, the elevator lit up on its own and descended empty to the basement. Westbridge Memorial Medical Center sits on the edge of a secondary highway that cuts through Ohio's countryside, a pale concrete building with mirrored windows that reflect the landscape as if the city had always been a reflection. Built in the 1970s and patched together in successive renovations, it blends new wings with corridors that creak under tired feet, modern plaques on walls that still smell of old varnish. During the day, it's a functional and noisy organism, with people being born and people who almost never return, machines that beep, voices that command, stairwells that vibrate. At dawn, however, the architecture changes expression. The corridors grow too long, the fluorescent lighting takes on an almost religious hum. The automatic doors breathe slowly, and there are corners where the temperature drops for no reason, as if the building suddenly remembered that it, too, can die. In the security room, 4 monitors divide the hospital into mosaics. East and West wings, elevators, basement, helipad, parking lot, loading dock, laboratory, pediatrics, ICU. The software records everything, but the sensors beep when there's life. And that's the rule that sustains the shift. Without a sensor, there's no one. Without one, you go back to the coffee and the habit. That night, what broke wasn't just the image, it was the rule. A shape crossed the hallway, and nothing that detects heat, movement, sound, or weight wanted to acknowledge it. The standard report, video, anomaly, would have been the easiest way out, but the anomaly repeated itself on 2 floors and, for an unmeasurable moment, also in the parking lot, where the cameras captured a shadow stretched between 2 empty cars, with no light source to cast it. When the team tried to blame the system responded with impeccable numbers, clean logs, minimal latency, perfect synchronization. Ethan, who had worked there for 7 years, noticed the detail no one wanted to notice. If the building didn't see it, but the cameras did, then someone on the other side was making a point of being seen only by those watching the screens, and that someone, or that something, had chosen their living room as their audience. The routine dictated documenting in a spreadsheet, attaching a video clipping, sending it to IT, and forgetting about it. But Ethan's hand lingered on the keyboard, and his shift colleague, Valerie Chen, preferred to prolong the check, as if turning their face a little more to hear a whisper. They had been turning the night from 2:40 a.m., speeding through empty hallways, stopped elevators, abandoned gurneys for minutes that felt like hours. They paused when a cleaning cart left an unintentional puddle on the second floor. The water reflected off the ceiling, and for 2 frames reflected something the ceiling didn't have: a slanted shoulder, a hollow outline. They returned. They zoomed in. The Zoom software invented pixels that didn't exist, but behind the interpolation, there was a metallic sheen like wet rust. Valerie wrote down the time. Ethan scratched on the paper, short, anxious strokes that tried to keep his thoughts in check. The ambient audio, usually uninteresting, offered a strange gift when isolated: a constant bass frequency, a C too deep to be emitted by a standard hospital machine, which began seconds before the appearance and disappeared at the exact frame where the form vanished from the screen. The heat map, which should have shown bodies as living blobs, became deceptively uniform. Where the figure had passed, the temperature neither rose nor fell. It remained no reading, a dead grey, the kind of data the software treats as an error and sends to the trash. Ethan opened the logs from the occupancy sensors on the 3rd floor, all green, no activations. He opened the ones on the 5th floor, green. He opened the ones on the basement floor, a tiny blink at 0258.01, too misleading to be a guide, but enough for his spine to recognize the music his brain still pretended not to hear. In the corridor of the East Wing, where the windows overlooked the highway, the headlights of a truck cut through the darkness. In the reflection of the glass, the figure seemed to stop, turned toward the road as if unfamiliar with the idea of distance, and then pass through the image without twisting the world around it, without suffering from the glass, as if mirrors were not barriers, but doors that learn with the first crossing. Valerie suggested calling the supervisor. Ethan preferred to seek a second opinion from a human who didn't yet know where to look. They brought in a maintenance man, and it was worse. The man came in, scratched his head, looked at the screens, and said everything looked normal, that nothing was moving, that they should go to sleep. The detail that betrayed him was on the security room's own webcam in the upper left corner of the main screen. The reflection of the tilted window showed 3 people, not 2. When Ethan turned, there was no one behind. When he returned to the screen, the 3rd person had stepped out of the reflection with the naturalness of someone who knows their way around. The basement elevator opened without a call. The camera in the archive hallway, where cardboard boxes have slept for decades, activated on its own, and for a few seconds it lost the notion of depth. The image became flat, like an X-ray. Valerie breathed too loudly, and the microphone picked up her breath like wind in a cave. The spreadsheet was saved with a banal name, Review 02570305.xlsx, but her fingers trembled as if she had signed something more serious. Outside, a train crossed the valley, vibrating the metal of the building. Inside, the vibration seemed to come from above, from the ceiling to the heart. That was when the internal radio crackled on a dead frequency, and a breathless voice whispered something that neither of them could decipher because it wasn't a language. It was intention. The Westbridge basement is another hospital, inverted. Narrow corridors, concrete floors, lamps that take a second to accept the command to turn on, the mineral and damp smell of sweating pipes. It's home to the machines that keep the upper floor alive. Pumps, chillers, tanks, cables, and also the archive, which is never dead. Ethan and Valerie went down to check the elevator that had opened without a call. They brought flashlights, though they knew light rarely helps when what needs to be seen doesn't need light to exist. The doors closed softly, and floor 1 greeted them with a long sigh that could have been the air conditioning or a concrete lung. The camera in the south corridor showed dust dancing without wind, like hurried snow. The one in the archive, a row of boxes dated 10, 20, 30 years ago, labels lost their glue. On the floor, besides the recent footsteps of some cleaning employee, there were darkened circular marks in front of the door to Records C, 2 parallel circles, the exact size of feet, very close together, as if someone had been standing for too long, so long that the floor itself had decided to memorize them. Valerie photographed them. Ethan measured them with a tape. The measurements were human, and yet they weren't, because there was no weight, no creaking, no compression, no indication that anything with real mass wanted to exist there. The door to Record C was closed, but the film-covered glass window returned only a dull grey and a distorted reflection. When Valerie brought her face closer, the reflection delayed a moment, 2/10, maybe 3. Her mouth opened, and on the glass, opened again a moment later, as if the basement were learning to repeat itself before obeying. Inside the room, boxes, on top of the boxes, folders, inside the folders, newspaper clippings and medical reports containing words like hallucination, delirium, and hypoxia tried to convince the paper that the right explanation had already been found. A clipping from 1989 spoke of anomalies in Westbridge's East Wing at dawn, one from 2003 of power glitches around 3 a.m. Nothing as direct as the format from last night. Still, in ballpoint pen, at the bottom of a report, someone had written, "He passes without weight." Valerie took the folder to her desk, and when she turned, she saw the hallway through the rectangle of the door. Empty, solid, concrete. But the basement monitor, still connected to the security room 3 floors, above showed the same hallway with Apperson standing in profile, a tall figure, his head tilted slightly to the left as if listening to something coming from inside the wall. Ethan called on the radio, asked if anyone was there. Only a hiss answered, and the hiss, for a second, seemed to form a syllable that wasn't English. The light above them blinked 3 times, rhythmically, and then stopped. On the floor, a long, dark thread that looked like hair, but when Valerie tried to pick it up, it vanished into the air, like smoke, deciding it was smoke. The elevator dinged by itself, this time from the ground floor down, as if someone who didn't need an elevator was politely using it so someone would notice. The shaft camera showed perfectly still metal steps, but in the reflection of the steel door, a blur passed in the background, as if a shadow was in a hurry, and yet not in a hurry. Ethan slammed his briefcase shut and said they needed to go up. The subsoil responded with the same low rumble they heard in the video, and the sound came not from the ducts, but from inside their rib cages, as if their bones were vibrating in agreement. But before continuing the story, check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because there is a new video here every day. Back in the security room, they decided to set up a mosaic synchronized from the floors, side by side, milliseconds aligned. The system doesn't like emotional precision, but it accepted the math. 022, 56, 40 to 02, 59, 20. 12 cameras, from the basement to the helipad. What they saw wasn't the figure walking, it was the figure being at points that don't fit into a walk. It appeared on the 3rd floor at 12 seconds, on the 5th floor at 12 seconds, in the basement at 12 seconds. It wasn't simultaneous by bug, it was simultaneous by intention. From which Valerie concluded, with the calm that science lends to the desperate, that the building had been transformed into a hall of mirrors, but without mirrors, and that the thing crossed the floors through the only dimension humans pretend to control, time. When they zoomed in on the east corridor of the 8th floor, they saw a steel drinking fountain with a fine gleam. In the gleam, the shape tilted its smooth face toward within of the reflection, as if more interested in what the metal reminded her of than what the corridor offered. On the 2nd floor, a fire door opened 2 fingers and closed on its own, and the proximity sensor didn't change color. On the ground floor, the revolving doors turned around and stopped without wind. In pediatrics, a paper mobile began to spin in reverse, slowly, defying the need for air conditioning. The supervisor, finally called, entered, startled, and asked for the only thing bureaucracy allows in the face of the inexplicable: record and don't talk to anyone. Ethan nodded and secretly placed black tape over the blue light of the room's webcam, a reflexive gesture of someone who learned late that seeing is also exposing oneself. The figure on the 5th floor screen stopped in front of the window overlooking the highway and turned to the lens. At that moment, all the monitors lost color, as if someone had turned the world's saturation to the lowest setting, and the hospital was, for 2 seconds, in grayscale. When the colors returned, the ICU camera captured a detail that made both of them freeze. A patient, alone, unconscious, opened her eyes from her coma and turned her head toward the lens with precise slowness, as if answering a call from the wrong side of the hallway. The bed sensor didn't activate, the position alarm didn't sound, but the EKG wire showed a small plateau, a second without rising or falling, an interval of hearts that aren't part of living hearts. In the parking lot, the external camera showed an elongated puddle reflecting the hospital sign. In the reflection, the letter B was missing. The light blinked, and the letter returned. Valerie typed a question in the system's internal chat, not to anyone, but to the software itself. "Who are you?" The text box disappeared on its own. When it reappeared, the word "here" was written without her fingers touching the keyboard. The wall clock read 2:59:59, and instead of advancing, stopped. The second lasted longer than seconds last, and the helipad camera, which never shows anything, captured a shadow crossing the edge's light line, as if the sky had decided to walk through the building. The Westbridge has an architectural peculiarity. Certain interior doors are lined with stainless steel, not for aesthetic reasons, but to comply with sanitation protocols in critical areas. This means that, in several points throughout the building, reflective surfaces reflect sections of the hallway, capturing angles that cameras don't. It was one of these doors that revealed something to Ethan and Valerie they weren't supposed to see. It was 3:06 a.m. when the 5th floor elevator opened on its own. No patients, no doctors, no gurney wheels. The hallway seemed empty, but the polished door to the nurses' station revealed a patch of floor where someone's shadow was cast, someone who wasn't physically there. The shadow moved its head up and down, as if examining the ceiling, and then tilted to the side, a slow, almost curious gesture. Valerie adjusted the zoom on the nearest camera and compared it with the reflection. In the reflection, the outline was more defined, but there were no features, just that dark surface that seemed to absorb light. As they watched, the shadow in the reflection made an impossible movement. It took a step toward the reflection's camera, which, in the logic of physics, would mean passing through the door. In the real world, the door remained untouched, but the reflection changed composition, as if the imaginary lens had been pushed back. The most disturbing part came seconds later. On the counter at the nurses' station, a disposable cup filled with water sat motionless. In the reflection, the water inside the cup moved in slow circles, as if someone were blowing on it, but the actual cup remained static, its surface smooth. Valerie captured the frame, and the image file returned with its name automatically changed to IMG 1001. They had never seen the system rename files this way. The numbering suggested it was the first of something, and the prospect of there being a 02 was more threatening than comforting. Ethan decided to physically check the place out. When he arrived, he found the hallway empty except for a metallic smell in the air. As he leaned against the steel door, he felt a distinct chill, not the diffuse chill of the air conditioning, but a localized chill, as if something were glued to the other side. He called Valerie on the radio, and the sound that returned wasn't her voice, but a low crackle followed by a silence that seemed to expand the room. He returned to the security room, and Valerie was pale, staring at the basement camera screen. The door's reflection still showed the hallway, but now, where the shadow should have been, was Valerie's silhouette, still and unmoving, despite her sitting beside him. Intrigued and now outside the protocol area, they decided to descend again to the basement. This time, their destination wasn't just Record C, but a locked room with the name partially faded from the sign. Sir Room. Ethan had heard from a former employee that this was the survey room, a space used in the 1980s for patient interviews and VHS recordings of clinical cases. When they forced the lock, they found shelves of dusty tapes, some labeled only with dates and initials. They chose a random tape, 04-17-1987, KD. In the video, an elderly woman, visibly frail, sitting in a wheelchair, answered questions about the visitor. She spoke softly but clearly. She said he didn't come through the door, but arrived right inside, as if the room were his. The interviewer, off-screen, asked how she knew it was. Always the same one. She replied, because he remembers. He knows I've seen him before. Ethan and Valerie exchanged glances. The woman in the video suddenly stopped talking and looked directly into the camera, not at the interviewer, but at whoever might be watching in the future. A faint smile formed, and in the corner of the frame for less than a second, a tall shadow crossed the wall. They continued watching more tapes, and patterns began to emerge. Apparitions always between 2:50 and 3:15, a preference for east and west corridors, and in rare cases a type of interaction with objects that only appeared in the recording, never live. In one 1992 tape, a patient held a hand mirror. In the reflection, the figure passed behind him, but the room, in the normal image, was empty. At the back of the room, they found a portable audio recorder with a tape inside. When they pressed play, they heard typical hospital background noises, and 2 minutes in, a deep, inhuman voice uttered something that sounded like a name, but so low it was felt more in the chest than heard in the ears. Ethan turned off the device, and the silence that followed seemed denser than before, as if the sound had left a vacuum. They took the recorder and 3 tapes to the security room, but when they tried to copy the files to the server, the system refused, citing format incompatibility. The screen briefly displayed the same word Valerie had seen earlier in the internal chat. Here. Have you ever witnessed a supernatural event? Tell us your story in the comments. They decided to monitor all floors simultaneously, focusing specifically between 2:50 and 3:15. They divided the screens. Ethan was assigned the basement, ground floor, and 3rd floor. Valerie the 5th, 7th, and helipad. The idea was to identify movement patterns. But what they saw was the opposite. No physical movement, yet multiple presences. At 3:02, the figure appeared in the basement, its back to the camera, staring at the wall as if something there interested it. At the same second, on the 5th floor, it appeared in profile in front of the nurse's station. On the 7th, it was standing at the end of the hallway. The difference wasn't milliseconds, It was perfect simultaneity. With each new appearance, the sensors remained silent, but the ambient audio recorded the same deep sound, always the same. Valerie noticed that when she increased the volume, a second, irregular sound could be heard in the background, like very slow knocks, not footsteps, but something larger, deeper. Ethan compared the recordings and realized that the knocks were identical on all 3 floors, as if the same pulse echoed in different places at the same time. At 3:07, the images began to show what they called misalignment. The figure would make a movement on one floor, and seconds later, the same movement would appear on another, but with a different detail, a tilt of the head, a rotation of the shoulder, as if testing variations. On the 7th floor, for example, he leaned to the right, in the basement to the left. At the height of the observation, all cameras suffered a simultaneous glitch, freezing for 3 seconds. When they returned, the figure was missing. However, on the helipad camera, something completely unexpected appeared. A pair of circular marks on the ground, side by side, in the same pattern found underground. The pediatric ward at night is a collection of soft sounds, the spaced beeps of monitors, light, breathing, the muffled squeak of rubber toys being handled by small hands even in sleep. That morning, the hallway camera captured something subtle. A paper mobile over a crib began to spin slowly, but in the opposite direction of the air conditioning. At 3:04, the rotation accelerated without any airflow being detected. The nearby camera showed, in the reflection of the door's glass, a tall shadow standing next to the crib. Inside the room, visible to the camera, there was nothing. The baby opened his eyes, looked up, and smiled. It wasn't a random smile. It seemed like a response to something specific. Valerie, watching the scene, called out to Ethan. As they watched, the mobile stopped abruptly and, for less than a second, cast a shadow on the ceiling that didn't correspond to its physical form. The outline was human, leaning over the crib. The baby reached out into the void. Alarmed, they checked the motion sensors, all inactive. But the camera's microphone picked up the same, low-pitched sound, accompanied this time by a metallic click, as if something small and sharp had touched metal. Reviewing the audio, they noticed that the click repeated at regular intervals, coinciding with the movement of the mobile's paper propellers before stopping. The Westbridge glass corridor, which connects the east wing to the research tower, is the hospital's newest addition. During the day, sunlight streams through its transparent walls, casting long shadows on the white floor. At night, however, it transforms into a dark tunnel suspended above the internal garden, lit only by LED lights embedded in the floor. It's a space that always makes employees uncomfortable. There's nowhere to hide, but also nowhere to escape. In the early hours of the morning after the pediatrics incident, the camera positioned in the middle of the glass corridor recorded something that, at first glance, appeared to be just a lighting failure. One of the LED lights went out and then came back on, with a half-second delay, then 2 more. In sequence, all the lights went out, one by one, bringing a dense darkness closer that seemed to advance down the corridor. When only the last point of light remained, the silhouette appeared, tall, motionless, occupying almost the width of the glass. Valerie called Ethan, and together they watched the footage in real time. The figure didn't move, but the darkness behind it seemed to writhe, as if something alive was stirring just out of view. In the reflection of the glass which showed the inner garden, there was an impossible detail. The figure was facing the camera, but in the reflection, its back was turned, as if it were another entity looking in the opposite direction. They decided to zoom in. The system responded unusually slowly, as if processing more data than it should. Upon reaching maximum zoom, the face, or lack thereof, filled the entire screen. The smooth, dark surface rippled slightly, as if beneath it was slowly boiling. Water. Then, in the reflection, something different. Two cavities opened, exactly where the eyes would be, but filled with a pale, almost silvery glow. At the same moment, the camera at the other end of the corridor, facing the tower entrance, captured an identical figure entering the building, even though the figure in the middle of the corridor remained still. For seconds, there were two identical presences in different locations, both clearly recorded. The most disturbing thing was the E ending. The hallway lights came back on in reverse sequence, as if the darkness were receding. When the last light came back on, the hallway was empty. But in the reflection of the glass, beyond the garden, something was moving too fast to be human. Operating Room 4, shut down for maintenance, had been empty for weeks. Tools were covered with blue cloths, metal tables pushed into the corner. Monitors were turned off. No one was supposed to enter the room at night. But at 3:09 a.m., the internal camera began transmitting a visual hiss, as if there was signal interference. Ethan noticed that the noise pattern wasn't random. The static lines formed curves and intersections that, when paused, resembled rudimentary symbols. They adjusted the audio, and along with the steady bass, they heard another noise, a repetitive metallic clink that resembled surgical instruments being moved. The image stabilized, revealing the empty room, but one of the blue cloths lay on the floor, as if it had been pulled. The most disturbing thing was the shadow projected on the wall. There wasn't enough light to create a shadow in that position, and yet, there it was. The outline was human, but oddly proportioned, with arms longer than normal. The shadow moved slowly, as if examining the space, and then stopped in front of the door, facing the glass separating the living room from the hallway. In the hallway, an external camera captured a detail that Ethan only noticed upon review. In the glass, the reflection showed the figure inside the room, but also another figure standing next to the viewer, as if the camera captured more than what was physically present. Valerie paused the frame and increased the brightness. A face could be seen in the second figure's reflection, but face might have been overly generous. They were merely suggestive marks of eyes and mouth, distorted, as if being erased in real time. When they returned to the live recording, the room was as before. Cloths on the tables, instruments in place. The shadow had disappeared. However, in the bottom corner of the image, text appeared in white letters. 3:14, same time as the other demonstrations, but inserted directly into the camera feed without anyone having changed the system. The Westbridge underground parking garage is spacious, dimly lit, and echoes with every footstep, as if the concrete amplifies the sound. Shortly before 3 a.m., the camera in Sector B captured movement in the background. A figure walking between the cars, but casting no shadow underfoot. Intrigued, Ethan switched to the thermal camera, and the figure vanished completely, as if devoid of body heat. Valerie, on the other hand, noticed something even stranger. The ambient microphone was recording footsteps, but they didn't coincide with the figure's movement. It was as if the sound was lagging behind the image, a second or two out of sync. The footsteps were slow, shuffling, and interspersed with a low, whisper-like sound. They decided to isolate the audio and amplify it. The whisper didn't form recognizable words, but it conveyed a clear intention. It sounded like a call, an invitation. As they played the sound, they noticed that the figure in the recording seemed to react, turning its head toward the camera. Then something happened live in the security room itself. They heard the same whisper, coming not from the speakers, but from the hallway behind them. Ethan swiveled in his chair and saw through the glass door a shadow cast on the floor, but it didn't correspond to anyone outside. The shadow moved slowly forward until it was glued to the glass, and then disappeared. In the parking lot, the figure approached a car parked near the exit. The vehicle's lights flickered slightly, as if there had been a power outage, and the alarm sounded for 3 seconds before going silent. When the camera returned to normal mode, the figure was gone. But on the ground, 2 circular marks, identical to those seen underground and on the helipad, were etched in the dust. After weeks of incidents, unofficial reports began to emerge from staff across various departments. An ICU nurse reported that, during a shift, he saw a shadow moving behind a sedated patient through the isolation room window. Upon entering, he found the room empty, but the heart monitor had registered a pause of exactly 3 seconds in the normal rhythm. A radiology technician reported that while processing an image, she noticed a blurred silhouette behind the patient, a silhouette that did not appear in the original exposure. When she tried to save the file, the system crashed, and the image was replaced with the word "here." There were also reports from visitors. A woman waiting in the pediatrics hallway claimed to have seen her own face reflected in the glass of a door, but with her mouth moving on its own, as if another voice were speaking through her. A hospital volunteer swore that, while walking down the east corridor, she felt someone grab her arm, but when she looked, there was no one there, just the sensation of cold fingers that took minutes to disappear. All the reports had one thing in common. They always occurred between 2:50 and 3:15, and they all left the impression that the presence was not restricted to a specific place, but moved wherever it pleased. Ethan and Valerie never officially spoke again about what they saw at Westbridge. The final report, filed under video anomaly, makes no mention of figures, reflections, or sounds, but they both know that what happened didn't end with that series of late nights. Months later, now working at another hospital, Valerie was on duty when the security monitor recorded a shadow crossing an empty hallway. The time on the screen read 3:14. She tried to ignore it, but the deep rumble that echoed through the room was unmistakable. Turning to the door, she saw her own reflection in the glass, and behind it, the figure, motionless as always, watching. The sensation was the same as every other time. The air felt heavier, the chill localized, the feeling that every thought was being read. But there was something new, a slight tilt of the head, as if acknowledging that he no longer needed to introduce himself. Valerie understood, with the clarity that comes before fear, that maybe it wasn't about Westbridge or cameras or schedules. Maybe it was about being seen, and once seen, never left alone. In the silence that followed, the monitor flickered, and for an instant all the screens displayed the same word, "Here." Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.